Welcome to our lecture looking at the intersection of social vulnerability and capacity issues. The PowerPoint that you'll be following along with is labeled the Vanguard approach, vulnerable adults and capability issues. During this time, I'll use the word capability and capacity to really largely mean the same thing, although somehow in the literature there are certainly conversations about whether or not capacity and capability mean the same thing. I'm happy to have those conversations with you. But for this program, we will use the terms capacity and capability in a largely interchangeable context. I do want to make a mention at the beginning that the laws across the country are all different with regards to some of these languaging. And so in some of your jurisdictions, you will use the words capability. In some of the jurisdictions, you'll use the words capacity. So it's for that reason that we'll use them interchangeably. Turning to the slide that's labeled the international context. When we're talking about issues of vulnerability, we're really looking at how do we think that people are safe and well and supported? It's really important that when you look at the background materials, the Vanguard project, you'll see that there is a reconceptualization of the term vulnerability. I think it's really important to say that vulnerability in this context doesn't mean that a person is inherently vulnerable. And certainly, people are not vulnerable by the mere fact of their age. And we'll get into that a bit later into our other lectures and further into this one as well. So if people are not vulnerable by their age, what are they vulnerable from? We believe that in the Vanguard approach, they're vulnerable due to social condition, and that everyone can be vulnerable to some degree. If you're looking at the social determinants of health, you'll also see that in those framings, you will see financial issues, social issues, isolation issues, rights issues. And we're kind of taking that social determinants of health approach. So I hope you have an opportunity to click on some of the materials that I've given to you on the social materials of health. That will help to provide some background. I also have in the slide a few sort of international flags for you, just to let you know there are a number of international arenas for the notion of capacity and vulnerability being discussed at an international level. We're going to focus in on what's happening in Canada, but I just wanted to start off by telling you that there are these kinds of international aspects. The last one says the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is particularly important because Article 12 talks specifically about capacity and possibly vulnerability, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. So it's important also that when we are talking about these things nationally and internationally that we kind of use the same benchmarks. And so I'm going to give the benchmark that's often used about the age of 65. Now, many of you will have been engaged in this field for a very long time and will be well engaged in the conversation around what does that age mean? Is that an appropriate age, etc. When I'm using the term older adults, I don't use a particular number or figure to describe what an older adult is. Rather, I think it's appropriate that people sort of self-describe and self-understand. Having said that, many of our rights or benefits are tied up around age. And in some cases it's 60, in some cases it's 65, in some cases it may be older than that. And recently, I've heard the Conservative government float some other ages as well. But it's important that when we do this international benchmarking, we are typically looking at 65 as the age. And in Canada, we will be the benchmark of 1 in 4 older adults by 2041. And in some jurisdictions, like for instance British Columbia, it will be earlier than that, where it's predicted it will be 2030. So it's important to understand that there is this general aging of the population, and that there are going to be increased numbers of capacity issues associated with that. I want to stop just there. Really important to say that while it is not true that all adults lose capacity, in fact most adults do not lose capacity as they age, there will be many more people who are older, living longer, and capacity does decline along that section. So just because you are old does not mean that you will lose capacity. Having said that, of the people who do lose capacity, more of them are older. And because we are having an age wave, we will have more of them. And we'll talk a little bit more about the impact of that later on. I also want to start off by challenging some myths. And as we go through this series, it will be important that we kind of come back to looking at the role of myths and narratives. And one of the big myths is that seniors don't add social value, or that people with capacity issues are unreliable by their nature. It's not true. People with capacity issues may have some challenges, but it does not make them inherently unreliable. And I also want to flag at the beginning that there's a sense that for some people, if there are capacity issues, people can't remember being abused, it doesn't cause harm. And we know that those things are not actually true. We know that harm can be remembered in all kinds of different ways. So as we go through this period, I want us to think about these myths. Seniors don't add financial or social value. People with capacity issues are inherently unreliable. And that if you can't remember abuse, it doesn't matter. So our agenda for this lecture will be to talk about what the new normal is. We're going to try to understand about capacity and vulnerability, and then we're going to be looking at integration into practice. So this concludes the first introductory download. We'll now move to the second one called What? Confronting the New Normal.